Toby Miller thought he had left his past behind. But as he drove through the misty mountains, a silent passenger sat beside him. Koda, his loyal German shepherd. Together, they had weathered wars both external and internal. Now the tranquility of nature should have offered peace. But something was wrong. Koda's sharp instincts led them to a discovery that would shake their lives to the core. What had they uncovered, and what secrets did it hold? Toby's bond with Koda was about to be tested in ways he never imagined. Watch the video to find out what happened next. Toby Miller sat behind the wheel of his truck, the worn leather of the seat creaking under his weight as the tires hummed against the wet asphalt. The gray fog of Seattle was heavy like a blanket, suffocating the life out of everything beneath it. It wasn't just the constant drizzle that weighed him down. It was the city itself. The dull concrete jungle where every building felt like a reminder of the life he had left behind. At 34, Toby was no longer the man he once was. As a senior chief in the Navy SEALs, his body had been a finely tuned machine capable of anything. But now, his body seemed to move on its own, like it had forgotten the purpose it once served. His mind, however, was far from silent. It was loud with the echoes of the war, the sounds of helicopters' gunfire, and the screams of the men he lost. The endless loop of nightmares and memories haunted him, forcing him to leave behind the military life that had once defined him. Now, as he headed east toward the Cascade Mountains, Toby could almost feel the tension slipping away just a little. His destination was simple peace, or at least that's what he hoped he would find. A break from the never-ending noise in his mind, the noise that never stopped even when the world around him was still. But peace was hard to find when your demons followed you like shadows lurking in the corners of your mind, always waiting to remind you of what you had lost. Beside him, on the passenger seat, sat Koda, his loyal 4-year-old German shepherd. Koda's coat was a rich black and tan, his sharp, intelligent eyes scanning the world outside the truck with a quiet alertness. Toby often found solace in the dog's presence. Koda was his constant, his grounding force in a world that often felt unreal and detached. The dog, like him, had known the horrors of war. But where Toby struggled to find his place in the silence, Koda seemed to thrive, innocent, the calmest companion Toby had ever known. The mist started to break as Toby turned off the highway and onto the narrow, winding road that led into the mountains. The truck rattled as it climbed, and Toby cracked the window, letting the cold autumn air rush in. The smell of pine and earth replaced the scent of exhaust and rain, and for the first time in what felt like years, Toby felt a little lighter. The weight on his shoulders eased, if only for a moment. He parked the truck at a trailhead he had found years ago, hidden from the world, known only to locals and serious hikers. He grabbed his pack more out of habit than necessity and slung it over his shoulder. Koda leapt out of the truck, landing softly on the wet ground, his tail wagging in controlled excitement. "All right, bud," Toby muttered, his voice rough from disuse. "Let's see the lake." They walked through the thick forest in silence, the sound of their boots muffled by the damp earth beneath them. The towering Douglas firs and granite cliffs surrounded them, forming a quiet fortress. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the occasional call of a distant bird. Toby felt the familiar tension in his muscles start to fade. The hypervigilance that had been a part of him for so long began to loosen, and the roaring in his ears, the phantom echoes of war, faded to a distant hum. By the time they reached the ridge overlooking Abbey Reservoir, the fog had fully lifted. Toby stopped, his breath catching, not from the altitude, but from the sight before him. The reservoir, once a pristine body of water fed by the snowmelt, was now a pale, cracked shell of its former self. The water level had dropped drastically due to a severe drought, revealing a barren, cracked landscape. The shoreline that had once been lined with dense forest now ended abruptly, giving way to a vast, empty space. It was as though the earth itself had been drained, leaving only the remains of what once was. Koda stayed close to Toby, his eyes scanning the desolate scene. Something was off, and Toby could feel it. The stillness in the air, the emptiness of the land felt like a mirror to his own soul. Drained, exposed with things surfacing that were meant to stay hidden. Toby's gaze lingered on the water's edge for a long moment, his thoughts heavy. Then, without warning, Koda's demeanor shifted. The dog froze his entire body, going rigid. A low, threatening growl vibrated in his chest, one Toby hadn't heard since their last training exercise. "Koda, what is it?" Toby asked sharply, his instincts kicking in his body, already slipping into the focused state of a seal. Koda ignored him, moving forward onto the exposed mud flats, his paws sinking slightly into the wet ground. The dog's eyes were fixed on something in the distance, his body taut with a sense of urgency. Then, without warning, Koda started to bark. Not a warning, but an insistent, frantic alert. Toby's heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong, very wrong. He grabbed his multi-tool from his pack and rushed forward, calling Koda's name. But the dog kept digging, his powerful paws tearing at the heavy, compacted mud, each motion desperate, as if the earth itself was trying to bury whatever secret lay hidden beneath. Toby knelt beside him, his hands brushing the fixed blade knife at his belt. What had Koda found? As he moved closer, the edge of something hard and metallic glinted from the mud. A sharp, rusted corner of what looked like a massive shipping container. Toby's breath caught in his throat. What had been left here, and why Koda barked again more urgently, his paws digging deeper. Toby reached forward, his fingers brushing against the cold metal, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He gently pushed Koda back. "Easy, I got it," Toby murmured, his voice tight with the intensity of the moment. Toby's hand trembled slightly as he pried at the rusted seam, the sharp metallic edge of the shipping container, groaning as it reluctantly gave way. The eerie silence of the lakebed around him was thick, pressing in on him from all sides. Koda barked once more, his voice frantic and insistent, echoing off the barren landscape as he dug with increasing urgency. His paws were slick with mud, each movement more desperate than the last, as though something in the earth was resisting their discovery. Toby's mind raced as he worked, pushing aside the mud with his multi-tool, his muscles straining. The air was thick with the musty smell of decaying earth, and the ground beneath his feet felt unstable, almost as though it were breathing. The lakebed, once full of water, now lay exposed under the harsh autumn sun, a cracked and broken mirror of its former self. The entire landscape was desolate, barren. Like something from another world, a place where time had stood still and all secrets had been buried in the silence. The heavy weight of the container's door finally gave way with a sickening creak. The air around them seemed to change, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. Toby's heart pounded in his chest. What had they uncovered? Koda's bark was louder now, deeper, almost a growl as he dug even harder. His tail stiff, his eyes locked on the dark gap where the door had cracked open. Toby stepped back, wiping the sweat from his brow, and glanced at the exposed metal. His breath hitched as his eyes fell on the markings, the faint symbol that had been barely visible at first, but now clearer. A Spartan helmet, the emblem of Sentinel. AVT-21. The words barely registered in his mind before he understood the magnitude of what he was looking at. His fingers brushed against the cool metal once again. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, a cold shiver running down his spine. This was no ordinary relic. It was too new, too well preserved for something forgotten by time. He looked at Koda, whose gaze never left the container, his body tense with anticipation. "Easy, boy," Toby murmured, trying to keep his voice steady, though his heart was racing. He reached forward with the pry bar, and after a few moments of effort, the door to the container finally yielded with a soft, sickening hiss. A rush of stale, damp air exploded out, carrying with it a nauseating scent. The unmistakable smell of death. Toby recoiled, covering his nose with the back of his hand. Koda whimpered, backing away, but his eyes remained fixed on the opening. Toby took a steadying breath, then looked inside with a cautious but determined gaze. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness inside the container. At first, all he could see were the skeletal remains of two bodies slumped against the walls of the container. They were dressed in tattered civilian clothing, their faces long gone, leaving only the remnants of who they once were. But what caught Toby's attention next was not the bodies, but the crates stacked neatly in the back of the container. His heart skipped a beat as his flashlight swept over them. These weren't the kinds of crates used for normal supplies. They were military-grade, bearing the unmistakable stenciled markings of advanced weaponry. High-tech rifles, encrypted communication gear. Toby felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew this was no ordinary find. This was something bigger, much bigger than he had anticipated. Koda's low growl broke through the tension in the air. Toby's eyes shot to the dog, who was still watching the crate intently. The growl deepened, and Koda barked once, the sound sharp and warning. "Stay close, boy," Toby whispered. He moved cautiously toward the crates, his pulse quickening. This was not a simple discovery. This was a treasure trove of military-grade equipment, and whatever secrets it held, they were now his responsibility. He moved through the containers, scanning the crates one by one. The stenciled markings matched those used for covert operations. Encrypted systems, short-barrel suppressed rifles, and advanced optics that were far beyond the standard issue for civilian use. But there was one thing that stood out even more: the GPS unit. It had been carefully buried in the back, partially hidden by the crates. Toby reached out his fingers, brushing the cold plastic of the device. It was rugged military standard, but it wasn't like anything he had seen before. Its screen was cracked, but it was still functional. As soon as his fingers made contact with the device, the small screen flickered on. The faint pulse of light seemed to come alive in the darkness of the container, and Toby's heart raced as the device began to transmit a signal. He stared at it, transfixed. A GPS locator. It was sending a signal, a beacon of some kind. And then, almost as if responding to his touch, the device flashed once more, a quick, bright flash. And then the signal cut out. Toby's mind raced, and he looked over at Koda, whose growl had quieted. The dog's eyes met his, and for a moment they shared a wordless understanding. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a forgotten relic. It was the beginning of something much larger, something dangerous. Without another word, Toby grabbed the device and carefully stowed it in his pack. He motioned for Koda to follow as he stepped out of the container, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The silence of the lakebed had returned, but now it felt different. It was no longer just a desolate place. It was a warning. Toby's thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, barely audible over the wind. It was a distant beeping noise, weak but growing louder. The signal had started again. And this time, Toby knew it wasn't just a random glitch. It was a call to something far darker than he could have ever imagined. Toby entered the cabin, the door creaking behind him as he set his pack down on the wooden table. He pulled the GPS device from the bag, examining it closely. The dark, rugged exterior was scuffed, but it was clear that this was no ordinary piece of equipment. His fingers hovered over the small screen, hesitating for just a moment before he powered it on again. The device flickered to life almost instantly, its low hum filling the otherwise quiet room. Toby felt a chill creep down his spine as the screen displayed a set of coordinates and a transmission status bar. A faint pulse of light flickered on the screen as it began to transmit. Toby's stomach tightened. This wasn't just any GPS. It was actively searching for something, broadcasting its own signal, pulling information from somewhere. The low beep of the device echoed in the cabin, growing louder, as if it were syncing with something far deeper. Something Toby couldn't quite grasp yet. His mind raced. What had he found? This wasn't just a forgotten military artifact. It was a key to something. As the transmission continued, memories from his last deployment in Kabul flooded back unbidden, like a wave crashing over him. Toby closed his eyes for a moment, letting the past wash over him. He could still hear the distant sounds of gunfire, the snap of a bullet whizzing by, the heavy breath of soldiers in their final moments, and the screams of his teammates. He had been there in the middle of the chaos, when everything had gone wrong. The mission had been a mess from the start, and in the end, they had lost 2 good men. They had been ambushed, their escape route cut off, and there was nothing anyone could do. The memories hit him with the force of a freight train, but he pushed them away, focusing on the device once more. The low beep had stopped, but the coordinates flashed again, the pulsing light in the cabin brighter now. Toby's hands clenched around the device as he realized just how closely this technology aligned with the mission he'd left behind. Koda, who had been lying quietly by the door, suddenly stiffened. His ears perked up and he gave a low growl that vibrated in his chest. Toby glanced down at his partner, whose gaze was fixed on the cabin door. The growl deepened, turning into an urgent, almost frantic bark. Koda's eyes locked with Toby's, as if to say, "Something is wrong." Without hesitation, Toby rose to his feet, moving swiftly to the window, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol at his side. His eyes scanned the darkening forest outside. Nothing moved. No sign of life, just the wind rustling the trees. It was then that he realized. The signal wasn't just a glitch. It had triggered something, some deeper connection. Toby looked back at the device, the faint glow still lighting up the room. And that was when he saw it. A small laser beam appeared on the ceiling of the cabin. The device, still connected to the satellite, was projecting a detailed image onto the wooden boards above them. It wasn't just a map. It was a map of the reservoir, the very lakebed he had just left. The beam traced the outline of the lake, highlighting an area where the water had once been. Toby's breath hitched as he recognized the spot. The exact coordinates where he had found the container. This was no coincidence. Whatever was buried there, whatever had been hidden, was connected to everything that had led him here. Toby stared at the laser projection, feeling a cold knot form in his stomach. This was a message. A message meant for him, but from who and why now? He reached for his jacket, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. Koda, still tense, followed closely behind him as Toby grabbed the keys to the truck. There was no time to waste. Whatever had been unearthed in that lakebed, whatever secrets lay hidden in the container, had to be dealt with now. Toby glanced at the GPS once more, taking note of the coordinates. It was time to go back. But this time, it wouldn't be just for peace. It was for something far bigger. Something that threatened to unravel everything he thought he knew. Toby drove back to the reservoir, the truck's tires crunching over the gravel road as the evening sky dimmed into a cold twilight. The coordinates from the GPS still burned in his mind, the laser projection from the cabin, now a haunting reminder of the mystery he had just stumbled upon. Koda sat in the passenger seat, his eyes scanning the darkening landscape. His body still tense, as if he too knew that they weren't just heading back to the lake for answers. They were heading into something much deeper, something dangerous. As Toby parked the truck, the same eerie silence that had greeted them earlier enveloped the lake once again. The water was lower than it had been before, a stark contrast to the full, pristine reservoir Toby remembered from his previous visits. But it didn't matter now. The lake, the land, the very earth beneath his boots. It had all changed. What lay buried here was no longer just a relic. It was a trigger that would set into motion something far darker than he could have ever imagined. He grabbed the multi-tool from the seat beside him and stepped out of the truck, Koda already moving forward with a low growl, sensing the shift in the air. The dog's tail was stiff. His eyes narrowed as if understanding that the past had found its way into the present. Toby approached the spot where the laser beam had indicated. Right near the edge of the dry lakebed, the earth was cracked and hard beneath his boots, the scent of decaying vegetation still thick in the air. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the barren landscape. But it was the ground beneath his feet that caught his attention. A corner of metal, dark and rusted, was sticking up from the mud, its jagged edges like the exposed bones of a long-forgotten beast. Koda, Toby muttered as the dog padded silently beside him. He crouched down, his fingers brushing the dry, cracked earth, and with one swift motion, he began to pry away the layers of mud and debris that had been left behind. It took only moments before he saw the unmistakable outline of a shipping container, its rusty surface half buried in the muck. Toby's pulse quickened. This was it. The same container he had found earlier, buried in the earth, waiting to be uncovered. His fingers tightened around the pry bar as he worked to open it. But something felt different this time. The weight of the moment, the knowledge that he wasn't just dealing with old military surplus, made his hands shake. With a loud groan, the door to the container finally gave way. A blast of stale, cold air rushed out from the dark interior, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of death, decay, rot, and something far worse. Toby recoiled instinctively, but his curiosity, his need for answers, pushed him forward. Inside, the sight was even more unsettling than he had imagined. The container was filled with neatly stacked crates. Military-grade crates stenciled with the unmistakable markings of advanced weapons and encrypted communication gear. The kind of equipment used for operations far beyond civilian reach. But it wasn't the crates that grabbed Toby's attention. It was the two skeletons slumped in the back of the container, their bodies sprawled out as if they had been discarded. Toby stepped inside, his heart pounding in his chest. The air was thick with the stench of decay, but he pushed through it, his eyes scanning the interior. As his flashlight flicked across the crates, his gaze fell on something small, half buried beneath a pile of old packing material. A military dog tag. He reached down slowly, his fingers trembling as he picked it up. The tag was old, worn, and scratched, but the name was still legible. Marcus R. Cole, a name Toby remembered from his last mission in Afghanistan. Marcus had been one of his closest friends, a brother-in-arms who had died in the ambush, his body never recovered. Toby's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. This wasn't just a random container. It was his past. Buried in the earth, hidden from the world. It wasn't just a forgotten mission. This was a military secret that had been sealed away for years, and it was connected to the men he had lost. He dropped the tag into his pocket, his mind reeling as he stepped back out of the container. The weight of the discovery, the connection between the bones and the weapons, was starting to unfold before him. This wasn't just a tomb. It was a warning. A warning about the dark forces that still lingered, waiting to finish what they had started. Toby froze as the sound of footsteps cracked through the silence. His instincts kicked in before his brain could process his hand moving to the knife at his belt. He turned sharply to see a figure emerging from the dense trees at the edge of the lakebed. The figure was tall, moving with purpose, wearing the dark green and gray uniform of the National Park Service. She stopped a few paces away, her posture stiff and wary. Alara Vance. Toby remembered her name from the brief conversation they'd shared during his last visit to the area. But now the familiar face of the park ranger looked like a stranger. Her eyes scanned the container, her expression hardening as she took in the sight. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice carrying a cool authority. Toby straightened, shifting his weight and slowly lowering his hand from his knife. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said calmly. He wanted to keep his tone steady, but the discovery weighed heavily on him, and his words came out clipped. "I found something. I didn't know this was a restricted area." Alara's eyes narrowed as she stepped closer, her gaze flicking to the shipping container, then back to Toby. She was cautious, but not hostile. Not yet. But the way she stood, her hand resting lightly on the holstered sidearm at her hip, told Toby that she wasn't about to let this slide without answers. Toby nodded toward the container. "This wasn't part of my plan. My dog. He found it." Alara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked to the edge of the container and crouched down, inspecting it closely. The rusted metal, the faint outline of the Spartan helmet symbol on the side. She frowned and stood up slowly, her face a mask of professionalism, but there was something behind her eyes, a flicker of recognition. "That's an AVT logo," she muttered mostly to herself. "Ares Venture Technologies." Her voice dropped just enough for Toby to catch the subtle shift in tone. "What's this doing here?" Toby's heart skipped a beat as he met her gaze. "You know them?" Her eyes flicked back to the container, and the coldness in her stare deepened. "I should have known. My father. He used to investigate AVT. He had his suspicions about them. They were buying up land around here, pushing the boundaries, flying helicopters at night. He thought they were running something under the radar." Toby's mind raced as Alara continued. He took a slow step forward, but she raised a hand to stop him, her gaze locking with his. "My father," Alara said, her voice strained, "was the head ranger here for 30 years. He died 5 years ago. Heart attack, they said. But before he died, he was obsessed with AVT. He filed reports, but no one listened to him. They called him paranoid crazy. They buried him in paperwork. His superiors dismissed his findings as the ramblings of a man losing his touch." Her words hung in the air, and Toby's thoughts churned. What had Robert Vance known? Toby stepped closer, his eyes fixed on her. "Do you think your father was onto something?" She hesitated for a moment before nodding slowly. "I know he was. He just didn't have the proof to back it up. They were doing something up here. Something dark. But he couldn't figure out what it was." Toby glanced at Koda, who stood at attention beside him, still as a statue, his eyes scanning the area. Toby looked back at Alara, his voice low. "If what I've found is connected to what your father was investigating, we need to find out what's really going on here. This is bigger than we thought." Alara's jaw tightened. She shifted her weight, looking around them at the vast, empty landscape. For a moment she didn't speak, but then she met Toby's eyes with a flicker of resolve. "I think you're right," she said, her voice firm. "But you can't do this alone. If AVT is involved, it's bigger than just us. We need to work together." Toby nodded, a sense of relief flooding through him. For the first time since arriving, he felt like he wasn't in this fight alone. "All right. But we do this my way," Toby said, his voice hardening with purpose. "We get the truth, no matter what it takes." Alara looked him over, sizing him up before nodding. "Deal." The cabin was quiet except for the steady hum of the GPS device. Toby and Alara sat side by side, both focused on the small screen in front of them. The faint glow illuminated their faces in the dim light, casting long shadows across the room. Toby's fingers hovered over the device, each beep from the GPS ringing louder in his ears as the coordinates and encrypted data began to unfold. The map of the lakebed was still on the screen, but there was more now. Hidden files, coded information, and strings of numbers. Toby frowned, scanning the screen as the file decrypted his mind, racing with the possibilities. This wasn't just a set of coordinates. It was much more. As the data loaded, he saw the words Project Sentinel appear, followed by DNA analysis complete and a set of coordinates that matched the location of the lakebed they had just come from. His heart skipped a beat as the implication hit him. This was it. The project, the hidden mission, the people involved, it was all connected. But there was something else. The last line of the document was a warning marked in bold containment breach. Biosecurity Level 4. Toby glanced over at Alara, who was leaning in closer, her expression taut with concentration as she read the screen. She didn't speak for a moment, her eyes tracing the lines of text, the weight of the discovery settling between them. Toby knew she was processing the same thing he was. This wasn't just about buried secrets or hidden military equipment. It was about bioweapons, DNA manipulation. Something far darker than they had anticipated. Koda, Toby said softly, the words barely leaving his mouth before the dog reacted. Koda had been sitting quietly beside them, his body stiff and his eyes fixed on the device in Toby's hands. But now his breathing had changed. He was panting faster, his tail flicking nervously. The growl that began low in his chest sent a ripple of unease through Toby. The dog's reaction was immediate. Toby's heart raced as Koda moved restlessly, his eyes darting between the GPS screen and the door. Toby knew something was wrong. Koda never reacted this way unless something triggered his instincts. He looked at Alara. "What's going on with him?" Alara turned her head, her face pale as she watched Koda. "It's the frequency," she said quietly, her voice tense. "My father used to mention the odd noises in the area. Interference from AVT's operations." But Koda's response, "This is more. It's like the signal is affecting him." Toby's eyes snapped to Koda. The dog was now pacing restlessly around the cabin, his body vibrating with the urgency of a deeper primal understanding. The frequency that was emanating from the GPS was clearly affecting him. Toby felt a cold knot in his stomach. "There's something here," Toby muttered, his voice tight. He glanced at the screen again, his mind piecing the puzzle together. If AVT is behind this, then they might be hiding a neurocontrol bioweapon. Something that affects the brain, human or animal. Alara's breath hitched as she looked at him. "You think they're controlling the animals with this signal? Or even the soldiers? Like they're testing it?" Toby nodded grimly. "That's exactly what I think. This is no longer about weapons. This is about control." The silence in the cabin deepened as the reality of their discovery settled in. AVT had been hiding something deadly, an experiment far beyond the usual scope of military arms and technology. It was possible that the very signal they had uncovered was part of a larger neuroweapon that could control behavior. Toby's mind flashed back to his time in the military, to the dark operations that never made it into the news. He thought of the whispers, the rumors about experiments in biological warfare. But never had he imagined it could be something like this. Koda continued to pace, his growls soft but constant. Toby watched him for a long moment, his mind working at full speed. The dog's reaction wasn't just instinct. It was a warning. Toby turned to Alara, his voice low and steady. "We need to get to the bottom of this. We need to track down what's left of this project. And we need to do it fast. Whatever AVT is planning, they can't be allowed to finish it." Alara met his gaze, her resolve hardening. "I'll help you. But this is bigger than both of us. If my father was right, we're stepping into a hornet's nest." Toby stood tucking the GPS device into his pack. "I know. But we don't have a choice. Let's move. We find out what they're hiding and stop it." Koda barked sharply, as if in agreement, and Toby reached down to pat him, grateful for his loyal companion. The dog's eyes met his, and for a moment the connection between them felt like something much more profound than just a bond of man and beast. They gathered their gear in silence, Toby feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They were on the edge of something much larger than they had ever imagined, and the deeper they dug, the more dangerous the truth would become. Toby and Alara moved quickly, grabbing their packs and making their way toward the door. Koda followed closely, his body tense eyes scanning the cabin's dark corners as if he too could sense the growing danger. The tension in the air was palpable, and Toby could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. They were no longer just investigating a conspiracy. They were in the middle of it, and there was no turning back now. As they stepped outside, Koda's low growl cut through the silence. The dog's ears were pinned back, his body rigid, and Toby knew instantly that something was wrong. The growl deepened a warning from Koda that sent a cold chill down his spine. Toby turned sharply, scanning the surroundings. The trees loomed dark and still around them, the only movement the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. But then he heard it. A faint rustling from the direction of the road, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots crunching on gravel. His instinct screamed at him, and in that instant, Toby knew they weren't alone. "Get down," Toby hissed, grabbing Alara's arm and pulling her behind the cover of a large rock at the edge of the cabin. Koda was already in position, his ears swiveling toward the source of the sound, his body low to the ground. Toby peered around the rock, his eyes narrowing as he saw them. A team of highly trained soldiers moving swiftly toward the cabin. They were well equipped, their movements coordinated and purposeful. Toby's pulse quickened as he recognized the leader, Hex Gideon, the cold, calculating operative who had been part of Croft's security force. Without a word, Hex signaled to his team, and Toby heard him bark orders in a low, steady voice. "Sweep the area, clear the cabin. No traces." The words sent a chill down Toby's spine. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to erase any evidence that had been left behind. Toby's mind raced, calculating their options. There was no time to run, not with Hex and his team closing in. His eyes flicked toward the shed where his gear was stored, and then to the crate where he had hidden the GPS device. It was too risky to move it now. Then an idea hit him. He turned to Alara, his voice low but urgent. "We need to cover our tracks." Without waiting for a response, Toby reached into his pack, pulling out a small smoke grenade. He had kept it in case of emergencies like this. With quick, practiced hands, he primed the grenade and tossed it toward the side of the cabin. The device hissed as it released a thick, acrid cloud of smoke that quickly engulfed the area. The soldiers didn't hesitate. They reacted instinctively, moving into defensive positions, their rifles raised as they tried to locate their targets in the thickening smoke. But in that moment, Toby and Alara were already on the move. "Go now," Toby shouted, grabbing Alara's arm and pulling her toward the woods. Koda was already ahead of them, moving like a shadow guiding them through the trees. As they ran, the sound of gunfire echoed behind them, the harsh crack of suppressed shots cutting through the smoke. Toby didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. They had to get as far away as possible. Minutes later, the distant sound of an explosion ripped through the air, followed by the unmistakable roar of flames. Toby felt a pang in his chest as he realized what had happened. The cabin, his refuge, his past, was gone. The fire burned bright against the night sky, sending plumes of smoke rising into the air as though the earth itself was marking the moment. His past had been erased in a matter of seconds. Koda returned to Toby's side, his fur singed, his eyes still alert. Toby reached down, his hand trembling as he patted the dog's head, feeling the warmth of the moment. Koda's soft lick across his hand brought a sense of calm, but it didn't erase the pain of what had just happened. Their world had just been turned upside down, and there was no going back. The night was still heavy with the smoke from the burning cabin as Toby and Alara made their way through the forest, moving in silence. The air was cool, the scent of pine and wet earth mixing with the lingering stench of fire. Their footsteps were muffled by the thick undergrowth, but the urgency in their movements betrayed their calm exterior. They couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Not until they had answers. Alara led the way, her face determined, but there was a shadow in her eyes that Toby knew all too well. The loss of her father, of the man who had spent his life protecting these lands and uncovering the hidden truths about AVT, still haunted her. Toby could see it in the set of her jaw, the way she moved with purpose, but with the weight of her history on her shoulders. "We're close." Alara's voice broke the silence as she pushed through a thicket of trees. Ahead, a small clearing opened up, revealing the old ranger station perched on the side of Thunder Peak. It was a relic of another time, weathered and worn, but still standing strong against the elements. Toby glanced around, his senses heightened. They had to be careful. Hex, Gideon, and his team could be anywhere. But for now, they had a brief moment of safety. They entered the station, and Toby's eyes adjusted to the dim light inside. The room was sparsely furnished, just a few old wooden tables, a small fireplace, and rows of dusty shelves filled with old maps, field journals, and weather reports. Alara moved quickly to the back of the station, pulling open a heavy metal filing cabinet. She rifled through it for a moment, before pulling out a worn, leather-bound journal. She opened it, and Toby could see the faint yellowed pages, the ink smudged, but still legible. "This was my father's private journal," Alara said quietly, her voice trembling with a mix of reverence and grief. "It's the one he kept when he started investigating AVT. The official records were always too clean, too controlled. But this," she tapped the journal, "this is where he documented the things that didn't make sense." Toby nodded, stepping closer as she flipped through the pages. There were scribbled notes, strange symbols, and references to AVT's nighttime flights. Helicopters that flew low over the park, always under the radar. The more Toby read, the more his suspicions about AVT deepened. "This is it," Alara said, her finger tracing a set of coordinates written in a neat hand. "My father was tracking their flights. These numbers, they're tied to the reservoir. This is where they were operating." Toby's mind raced as he read the coordinates aloud. "This matches the spot where we found the container. And look here," Alara continued, pointing to a section of the journal. "This is what he called the dual frequency. He believed that AVT was broadcasting something, some sort of coded signal that interfered with the natural frequencies in the park." Toby's eyes widened. A frequency that's still active. And they've been tracking it all along. The realization hit him hard. The device they had found, the GPS, it wasn't just a random piece of military tech. It was part of the system, part of the signal that AVT had been tracking. They were looking for the device, and now they knew it was in Toby's possession. The journal's last entry was a chilling one. "If they find this, it's over. We've uncovered something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined." Toby stood up straight, his pulse quickening. The truth was becoming clearer now. They were not just dealing with rogue military tech. This was something biological, something that could change the course of human history. He glanced at Alara, his expression hardening with determination. "We have to decode this signal before they get to us. It's the only way we're going to stop them." Alara nodded, her resolve solidifying. "Agreed. But we have to move fast. We can't let them track us again." Koda let out a low growl, his body tense. Toby could feel the dog's unease, the way he reacted to the increasing pressure in the air. The sense of danger was closing in around them. Toby turned to Alara. "Let's go. We'll figure out the rest later." The sound of the drone was faint at first, like the hum of a distant wasp. But it quickly grew louder, filling the air with an unnatural whine. Toby's senses went on high alert, every muscle in his body tensing as the noise approached. He glanced around, but the trees and thick mist obscured the view. Still, he knew. It was AVT. "We need to move, now," Toby whispered sharply to Alara, his voice edged with urgency. Koda, always alert, suddenly froze, his body rigid. The dog's ears swiveled towards the sky, his hackles raised. Toby knew Koda wasn't reacting to the drone's noise alone. Something was affecting him, something deep. Koda let out a low, strained growl, his eyes darting frantically between the sky and Toby, his chest vibrating with discomfort. Toby looked up, narrowing his eyes against the mist. The drone's hum was unmistakable now, growing louder, circling them in a pattern. He could almost feel it, the presence of something watching them, something dangerous. Koda's growl intensified now, a low whine mixed with a sharp cry. The frequency from the drone wasn't just audible. It was hitting a frequency that was tearing through the air and into Koda's sensitive ears. Toby had seen this before during the training exercises. AVT used this frequency to control the behavior of animals. But to see it in action with Koda, to feel the dog react this way, was another level of terrifying. "Koda!" Toby snapped, stepping forward. But the dog continued to whine, his body trembling with distress. The drone's signal was affecting him, controlling him. Toby's heart raced, and instinct took over. His eyes flicked toward his pack. He'd kept a modified EMP grenade for emergencies, but he never thought he would need it like this. "Koda, stay down," he commanded firmly, his voice full of authority. He grabbed the grenade quickly, pulling the pin and tossing it towards the drone's presumed path. The flash of light, followed by a deep pulse, reverberated through the forest, the EMP sending a surge of energy through the air. For a brief moment, everything went quiet. But only for a moment. Toby's breath caught as the drone's noise paused, then resumed the hum, now distorted but still present. The EMP had created a temporary disruption, but the drone had adapted. They were already tracking them. It hadn't worked. They were being hunted. "We've lost the advantage," Toby muttered, his voice grim. Alara's eyes were wide with realization as she looked toward the sky. "They know where we are." Toby turned to her, urgency in his every move. "We need to get out of here now. Follow me fast." Koda barked sharply, his eyes now scanning the surrounding trees. Toby felt the dog's tension but focused on moving quickly. They didn't have much time before the drone would return, and when it did, it would be with backup. He grabbed Alara's arm, pulling her toward the cover of the thick trees. The mist hung heavy in the air, and the ground beneath them felt soft and treacherous as they sprinted through the forest. The occasional whine from the drone echoed through the trees, a constant reminder that they were not alone. Toby risked one more glance over his shoulder. The drone had already begun to descend, its bright floodlights cutting through the fog, scanning the ground below. It was closing in. "Go!" Toby shouted. He pushed Alara forward, urgency and adrenaline propelling them as the drone's lights blinked ominously, illuminating the trees in blinding flashes. With Koda by their side, they ran, moving deeper into the woods, zigzagging to avoid the drone's direct line of sight. The trees were dense here, but Toby knew the terrain. They could lose the drone, but only if they kept moving. Toby, Alara, and Koda ran with relentless urgency, their bodies moving in unison through the dense forest, the trees and foliage offering only fleeting cover from the drone's persistent pursuit. The fog around them was thick, and the cold, damp air seemed to seep into their bones, making every breath feel like ice. Toby's heart pounded in his chest as he led the way, glancing over his shoulder only when necessary, his mind calculating their every move. The drone's whine grew louder, but they were already diving into the narrow ravine that cut through the mountain. The steep walls of the ravine rose sharply on either side, making it difficult for the drone to track their movements, at least for now. Toby ducked under a low-hanging branch and pushed forward, motioning for Alara to follow. Koda, ever vigilant, led the way, his paws silent on the wet ground, his nose twitching as he guided them through the shadowed path. The ravine was a tight fit, but it was their best hope for avoiding detection. The coolness of the air became sharper as they descended deeper into the gorge, the sounds of the forest now muffled by the walls of rock surrounding them. Toby's pulse began to slow, but his senses remained sharp. The night felt strangely still, eerily quiet. As they reached a narrow ledge, Toby turned to check on Alara, who had been keeping pace behind him. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were still focused, her gaze sharp despite the circumstances. "Let's rest here," Toby said quietly. "We've lost some ground, but we're not out of the woods yet." Koda immediately sat by her side, his body close to Alara's, offering warmth and comfort in the cold, damp air. Toby pulled out his pack and sat beside her, keeping his voice low. The night felt like it was pressing in on them. The ravine, dark and isolated, seemed to swallow every sound. They were safe for the moment, but it didn't feel like enough. Toby couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger than this chase was at play. He glanced at Alara, the flickering light from their fire casting soft shadows on her face. "I'm sorry," she said. After a moment, her voice soft, the words heavy. "I didn't want you to get dragged into this. My father's obsession, it's cost me more than I care to admit." Toby nodded, his gaze focused on the fire. "You don't have to apologize. We're in this together. And you're right. Your father was onto something. But we don't have time to dwell on what happened. We need to figure out what AVT's up to before they catch up to us." Alara took a deep breath, the weight of her father's loss still hanging in the air. "I didn't think I'd ever be doing this, running through the woods with someone who used to be part of a secret military project." Toby raised an eyebrow, glancing at her. "What do you mean?" Alara hesitated, then continued. "I've been looking through my father's old files. He kept everything. He was obsessed with AVT, but he never stopped to consider what they were really capable of. He couldn't even understand the signal they were sending out. But I think he knew it was part of something bigger. He just couldn't get to it." Toby sat up straighter, his mind clicking into gear. "What are you saying?" She met his gaze, her expression serious. "Toby, your past. It's connected to AVT. You were part of the Sentinel project, weren't you? The program that used neural signals to control soldiers and dogs." Toby froze. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had hoped his past would stay buried. But now Alara had uncovered it just like her father had. His role in the Sentinel project was part of a history he had tried to forget, a history that had been swept under the rug. And now it seemed like that history was coming back to haunt them both. "I was part of it," Toby said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of the truth. "But I didn't know what I was getting into. They were using dogs and soldiers, training them with neural signals, pushing them to perform beyond their limits. But it went too far. We were pushing the boundaries of control." Alara's eyes were wide with understanding. "So Koda, he's not just any dog. He's part of that program. That's why he reacts to certain frequencies." Toby looked at Koda, whose eyes were now calm, but his body still alert. The dog had been part of something much bigger, something dangerous. But Toby didn't regret the bond they shared. Koda was more than just a product of the project. He was a friend, a protector, a constant. "I think Koda might be the key to unlocking the data we've found," Toby said softly, his voice full of resolve. "The frequency that AVT is using to track us, It's not just about weapons or technology. It's about control. And we need to understand it, or we're going to lose everything. Alara nodded, her expression hardening. Then we decode it. Together. Koda let out a low whine, pressing his head against Alara's leg, as if sensing the gravity of the situation. Toby gave him a reassuring pat on the head. It was time to move forward. The past had caught up with them, and there was no turning back now. The dense woods gradually gave way to a rugged path, the ridge spine that Alara had spoken of earlier. The trail was narrow, winding through thick clusters of ancient pines and jagged rocks. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner, colder. The faint mist that had been lingering at ground level now rose to meet them, enveloping the ridge in a quiet, eerie fog. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots against the rocky ground and the distant rhythmic rustling of leaves as a breeze cut through the trees. Toby's eyes darted around, scanning their surroundings, but his focus remained on the path ahead. Alara moved with practiced ease, her steps light and sure, as if this route was second nature to her. Koda led the way, his sharp nose to the ground, his ears swiveling back and forth as if he could sense any danger long before it reached them. Toby felt a sense of calm in Koda's steady pace, knowing the dog was not just guiding them, but protecting them, always one step ahead. The ridge spine wasn't just a physical path. It was a part of the mountain itself, ancient and winding, carrying the weight of stories from generations past. Alara had told Toby that her father had once described it as the heart of the mountain, a place where the land seemed to pulse with life, its rhythms deeply connected to the people who walked it. It felt as though the land itself held its secrets hidden deep within the jagged cliffs and rocky ravines. But despite the beauty and serenity of the place, there was something ominous about the trail. The trees around them were thick and dense, their trunks twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The sky above was an oppressive gray, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. It was a place of stark contrast, majestic yet haunting. Toby couldn't help but feel the weight of the silence pressing in on him. The world around him seemed far removed from the chaos that had consumed his life recently. But as he looked around, he couldn't escape the feeling that they were being watched, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Koda suddenly stopped, his head lifting as he sniffed the air. Toby paused, his hand instinctively resting on the handle of his knife. Koda's eyes were alert, his ears flicking back and forth. The dog was always one step ahead, and Toby trusted him completely. "What is it, boy?" Toby whispered. But Koda gave no response, his body tense and still. Alara also noticed the change in Koda's behavior and stopped beside Toby. "He's picking up something," she said softly, her eyes scanning the trees. "We need to stay sharp." They continued on, but the atmosphere had shifted. The ridge spine now felt more like a trap than a sanctuary. The path grew steeper, the rocks underfoot more treacherous. But Koda remained calm, guiding them expertly through the dense fog that seemed to grow thicker with each step. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the summit of the ridge. The fog began to dissipate, revealing the vast expanse of the valley below. The mist clung to the edges of the land, casting a ghostly glow over the treetops. And in the distance beyond the haze, they saw it. Abbey Reservoir. Toby stood at the edge of the ridge, his gaze fixed on the lake. It was almost unrecognizable. The water had receded, leaving a barren wasteland of cracked earth, dried-up stumps, and exposed mud. It was a stark contrast to the pristine reservoir he remembered. But it wasn't just the lake that had changed. It was him. The past he had been running from had finally caught up with him. And the haunting memories of his lost comrades, his mission, and the military experiments he had once been part of were all leading him back here. Alara stood beside him, her eyes also fixed on the lake. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of their shared understanding hung in the air, thick and suffocating. This was where it all began, and this was where it would end. The air was heavy with tension as Toby and Alara made their way back toward the container, their steps quick and quiet. The path was familiar, but it felt more treacherous now, each step seeming to echo in the stillness as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Koda, ever watchful, led the way, his keen senses alert to every change in the atmosphere. Toby could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just a return to the site of their discovery. It was a confrontation with the past, with everything they had uncovered, and with the dangers that were closing in around them. They reached the lakebed, the once pristine water, now little more than a memory, leaving only the cracked earth and twisted dead stumps of trees. The container was still there, half buried in the mud just as they had left it. The sight of it sent a chill through Toby's chest, but he steeled himself, knowing they had no other choice. "This is it," Toby said quietly, his voice steady despite the rising sense of dread. "We need to open it again. We have to finish this." Alara nodded, her face grim as she looked at the rusted container. She didn't speak. Words weren't needed. Both of them knew the stakes. With a swift motion, Toby reached into his pack and pulled out the GPS device. He held it in his hand for a moment, checking the coordinates once more. The signal from Koda had led them here, and now it was time to use it again. "Koda," Toby whispered, his voice low. The dog turned immediately, his body poised and ready. "Show us the way." Koda padded forward, his body low to the ground, his ears twitching as he approached the container. Toby and Alara followed the sound of their footsteps, muffled in the thick, wet mud. Koda stopped just in front of the container, his eyes locked onto the spot where the door had been pried open earlier. Toby took a deep breath and moved forward, using the pry bar again to force the door open. The air inside the container was stale, thick, with the scent of decay and rust. Toby stepped in his flashlight, cutting through the darkness. This time the feeling was different. The truth was here. It had been waiting for them. As he scanned the crates once more, his eyes fell on something new. A hard drive, partially obscured by a stack of equipment. Toby reached for it, pulling it free from the pile. The markings on the hard drive were clear of Project Rebirth. He held it up, his breath catching as he read the label. "This is it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is the key to everything." Alara stepped forward, her face pale as she looked at the drive. "What does it mean?" Toby didn't have an answer. He stared at the hard drive for a long moment, the weight of its significance heavy in his hands. Project Rebirth, a name that spoke of something new, something dangerous. Toby quickly stowed the hard drive in his pack, but before he could turn to leave, the unmistakable hum of a helicopter cut through the stillness of the air. It was distant at first, but growing louder, getting closer. "We've been made," Toby muttered, his voice tense. He reached for his gun, the reality of the situation settling in. They had opened the container, and now Croft knew. The stakes had just escalated. The sound of the helicopter grew louder, closer. It was coming for them. Croft's men were already on their way. The low, persistent hum of the helicopter grew louder, its sound slicing through the thick silence that had settled over the lakebed. Toby's pulse quickened as the distant noise grew into the unmistakable roar of blades cutting through the air. The trap was closing in. He could feel the weight of it. The ground beneath his feet, the stillness of the trees around him. All of it was a ticking clock, and they were running out of time. Toby exchanged a quick glance with Alara, his expression taut. There was no time to waste. Croft's men had found them. The helicopter, the precision of the mission. It was clear that they had been waiting for this moment. The data they had uncovered, the hard drive, had triggered something. Now there would be no more running. "We've been made," Toby muttered, his voice strained. He gripped his gun tighter, scanning the horizon for movement. He could already feel the heat rising in his chest, the instinct to fight kicking in. But they weren't alone. He could sense the presence of something more calculated, more organized. The helicopter's presence wasn't the only danger. The drone was still out there, its shadow looming in the sky. And then there was the unmistakable sense of movement on the ground, the strike team closing in. They were surrounded. Koda low crawl. Toby barked, his voice sharp. Koda immediately dropped to the ground, his body low, his movements swift and silent as he followed Toby's command. The dog's instincts were sharp, his focus on the mission unshakable. Toby and Alara mirrored Koda's movements, ducking behind a large rock formation that offered the only cover. The sound of footsteps, low and methodical, reached Toby's ears, but it wasn't enough. He could feel them getting closer, the team closing in from every direction. The tension was unbearable. Toby's eyes flicked to the helicopter, now circling overhead, its spotlight scanning the terrain. They were trapped. There was no escape route, no exit to the dense forest that wasn't already being covered. Alara, smoke. Toby ordered, his voice urgent. Alara immediately reached into her pack, pulling out a smoke grenade. With a quick motion, she primed it and tossed it toward the enemy's line of sight. The air filled with thick black smoke that obscured their vision, giving them a momentary chance to break through. The smoke provided a brief cover, but it wasn't enough. Shots rang out, and the sharp crack of sniper fire shattered the air. Toby heard the sound of a bullet zip past him so close that he felt the rush of air as it tore through the space beside his ear. Koda, Toby shouted, his voice tight with urgency. Before Toby could react, Koda sprang forward, charging through the smoke. The dog leapt into action, his powerful legs propelling him toward the source of the sniper fire. In the blur of smoke and shadows, Toby heard a low growl, followed by the sound of a soldier shouting in surprise as Koda tackled him. "Get down!" Alara shouted, yanking Toby down just as a bullet grazed his shoulder. The pain was sharp, but fleeting. Nothing compared to the danger that surrounded them. Toby was on his feet again in an instant, scanning for their next move. Koda had tackled the sniper, and Toby saw the soldier's rifle tumble from his hands, Koda pinning him to the ground. But there wasn't time to celebrate. The rest of the team was closing in fast, and they couldn't afford to get bogged down by one soldier. Koda backed, Toby commanded, but the dog hesitated, watching the sniper's struggling form. "Move now," Toby shouted. Koda, sensing the urgency, finally released his grip and sprinted back to Toby's side. The sniper barely conscious, but no longer a threat. "We need to move," Toby said, urgency creeping into his voice. "To the river now." They moved quickly, pushing through the dense underbrush toward the Skycomish River. The sounds of the strike team, rifles' footsteps, and the low hum of the helicopter grew louder, but they didn't stop. The river was their only chance. The Skycomish River roared in front of them, its waters surging with a force that could tear anything in its path. The only thing standing between them and freedom was the small inflatable raft they had found hidden by the riverbank. Toby, Alara, and Koda sprinted toward it, their hearts racing in unison with the sound of the approaching strike team. The thundering roar of the helicopter grew louder, its floodlights cutting through the trees, making every movement feel like a betrayal. Toby reached the boat first, pulling it into the water and quickly motioning for Alara to get in. "Get in now," he barked, already gripping the paddle. But as Alara climbed into the boat, the sound of footsteps grew louder. They were almost there. Suddenly, the strike team appeared on the far bank, emerging from the trees. A group of heavily armed soldiers lined the edge of the river, guns raised and aimed directly at them. Toby's breath caught in his chest. They weren't going to let them escape. "Go!" Toby shouted, throwing the engine throttle forward. The boat lurched into the river, its engine sputtering to life as Toby steered them out into the current. But just as they began to gain some distance, the sound of gunfire erupted from the shore. Bullets zipped through the air, striking the water around them in sharp splashes. Toby ducked low, the boat's engine struggling against the force of the current. Koda Toby shouted as the dog leapt from the boat, his powerful body launching through the air. In a flash, Koda landed on the enemy boat that was pursuing them, its engine roaring as it sped toward them. Koda's teeth sunk into the man's shoulder with a fierce snarl, sending the soldier crashing into the river. The boat veered off course as Koda tore at the soldier's rifle, tossing it aside. But the battle wasn't over. A loud crack of gunfire rang out, and Toby turned just in time to see a flash of muzzle fire from one of the enemy boats. The bullet hit Alara in the shoulder, causing her to cry out in pain. The impact sent her tumbling back against the side of the boat, blood staining her shirt. Koda, who had been momentarily distracted by the struggle, was thrown from the boat by the force of the shot, his body hitting the water with a heavy splash. Alara Toby shouted, his heart sinking as he watched her fall. But there was no time to stop. He grabbed the boat's rudder, forcing it to veer through the whitewater rapids. The current was pulling them, making the boat harder to control, but they had to push forward. With Alara still clinging to the side of the boat, Toby maneuvered them deeper into the river, the sound of gunfire echoing behind them. Every shot felt like it could be their last, but Toby's focus never wavered. He couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close to escaping. The roar of the helicopter faded slightly as they moved farther downstream, but they were still being hunted. Then came the final push. With one last desperate lurch, Toby steered the boat toward a narrow gap in the rapids, hoping the violent current would be their ally. But as they entered the narrow stretch, the boat tipped violently. Alara cried out, her hands gripping the edge of the boat. The boat seemed to flip for a moment, its side slamming into a jagged rock. Toby's heart skipped a beat as he saw Koda struggling in the water, his head just above the surface. But the dog was fighting, clawing his way toward the shore. Toby forced the boat toward the bank, knowing that the river was their only chance to escape. The drone still buzzed overhead, its shadow moving across the water like a hawk circling its prey. With one final burst of speed, Toby pushed the boat toward a secluded cove. The river had swallowed them, and the air was thick with tension. But for now, they had outrun the danger. As the boat scraped against the bank, Toby pulled it onto the shore and helped Alara out. She winced, her shoulder bleeding heavily, but she was still conscious. Koda, soaking wet but determined, trotted alongside them, his head low. "We're not safe yet," Toby said, his voice hoarse as he looked around. Alara nodded, her breath coming in short gasps. "We have to keep moving. They'll be after us." Toby gave her a grim nod. But for now, they had made it. They were alive. That was all that mattered. The air was thick with mist and the sound of rushing water as Toby, Alara, and Koda made their way toward the hidden cave behind the waterfall. The roaring cascade drowned out the outside world, providing them with the perfect cover, at least for now. The trees were dense here, the ground soft and treacherous, but it offered a temporary sanctuary from the chaos they had just escaped. Toby moved quickly, his heart still pounding in his chest. He couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. Koda trotted closely behind them, his fur soaked from the river, but his demeanor unchanged. Still alert, still protective. Toby helped Alara into the cave, her breath ragged and shallow. The sight of her injury, the deep wound to her shoulder, sent a jolt of fear through him. But there was no time to panic. "We need to stop the bleeding," Toby said, his voice strained as he knelt beside her. Alara winced as she leaned back against the cool rock wall, trying to steady herself. "I'm fine," she whispered, though the blood soaking her shirt told a different story. Just get me through this." Toby's hands were trembling as he dug into his pack for his first aid kit. He tore open the package with urgency, his mind focused on nothing but getting her stable. His fingers moved with practiced precision, but the shaking in his hands was harder to control than he expected. The adrenaline from the escape was still coursing through him, but there was something more, something deeper. It wasn't just the urgency of the situation that had him rattled. It was the sense of responsibility he felt. For the first time in a long while, he was not just following orders. He was fighting for something bigger than himself, for someone. Toby pressed a gauze pad against the wound, applying pressure to stop the bleeding. Alara winced, but she didn't pull away. She looked at him, her face pale but resolute, her eyes still sharp despite the pain. "Why did you come back?" she asked softly, her voice thick with curiosity and something else, something he couldn't quite read. "You could have run. You didn't have to get involved." Why? Toby paused for a moment, the question hanging in the air like a heavy weight. His hands remained steady as he worked, but inside his thoughts swirled. The truth was simple. The truth was something he hadn't allowed himself to admit until now. "Because for the first time in my life," he said quietly, his voice low, "I'm not fighting because of orders. I'm not fighting because of a mission. I'm fighting because I believe in something. I believe in this. In you, Alara." Alara's eyes softened at his words, the flicker of pain in them replaced with something else, understanding. She nodded slowly, her chest rising and falling with each shallow breath, but her expression was calm, as if she had already known this. Toby finished applying the bandage, his fingers still shaking as he tied the cloth off with a knot. He knew the wound wasn't going to be easy to heal, but it was enough for now. He sat back, taking a breath as he looked at Alara. "We're in this together," he said firmly, "and we're going to see it through. I don't know what comes next, but I know we can handle it. Together." Alara nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile despite the pain. Koda, ever watchful, sat nearby, his eyes scanning the entrance to the cave, his presence a silent sentinel guarding them from danger. For the first time in a long time, Toby felt a flicker of hope. But it was fleeting. They weren't out of danger yet. He could feel it in the air, the looming threat of Croft's men. They were being hunted, and Toby knew they couldn't stay here for long. But for this brief moment in the shadow of the waterfall, he allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in years' peace. The low sound of the waterfall filled the cave, a constant roar that masked the quiet tension in the air. Toby sat on the cold stone floor, his eyes fixed on the small satellite phone in his hands. The data they had recovered was vital, more than just military intelligence. It was the key to stopping AVT and the horrors they had unleashed. His fingers hovered over the keys, a deep sense of responsibility weighing heavily on him. He wasn't just sending a message to his team, he was sending a cry for help, a warning. If this data reached the right people, it could end the project, expose the truth, and save countless lives. If not, he didn't want to think about the consequences. Alara watched him silently, her hand resting on her injured shoulder. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence was enough, the bond they had formed over these past few days speaking volumes. Toby finally pressed send. The small screen flickered for a moment, the upload bar slowly filling with a signal that would reach his old SEAL team. He sat back, a brief sense of relief washing over him. They had done what they could. It was out of their hands now. But before he could relax, Koda's head snapped up, his body going rigid. The dog's sharp eyes scanned the mouth of the cave, and his low, deep growl echoed in the otherwise quiet space. Koda's ears flattened against his head as the hairs along his back stood up. Toby's heart skipped a beat. Danger was close. Too close. The uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at him all this time returned stronger now than ever. His instincts were screaming at him to move, but it was too late. He didn't need to hear the approaching helicopter to know that Croft's men had found them. The sharp whine of rotor blades pierced the night air, cutting through the dense fog as they hovered above, the sound of the blades growing louder with each passing second. "We've been made," Toby muttered under his breath. His grip tightened on the phone, his pulse quickening as he stared out toward the mouth of the cave. Koda stood up, his growl becoming more pronounced. The hunt had begun. Toby glanced at Alara. "We need to move now." His voice was urgent but calm. They had no time to waste. They had to get out of the cave and find a way to escape before Croft's men closed in on them. Alara didn't hesitate. She stood up, clutching her shoulder, wincing with pain, but moving with purpose. Toby grabbed the satellite phone and slipped it back into his pack, his eyes darting to the entrance once more. The noise of the helicopter was now deafening, drowning out everything else. Koda's low growl faded, and the dog's eyes softened as he turned to face Toby, waiting for his next command. Toby reached down and patted Koda's head, his voice steady despite the fear rising in his chest. "Stay close, boy. We're not done yet." The growl of the helicopter faded slightly, but it was still there, a constant threat. Toby knew they had to get moving before they were trapped. But as he turned to lead the way, the helicopter hovered just beyond the trees, casting a long shadow over the forest floor. They couldn't stay hidden for long. The roar of the helicopter grew louder, its presence looming over the forest like a predator circling its prey. Toby's instincts were on edge, every nerve in his body alert. But he couldn't help the sickening feeling that crept up on him as the shadow of the helicopter passed over the entrance to their cave. They had moments, only moments, before they would be discovered. As they prepared to move, a sudden crack of twigs and the sound of boots on the forest floor stopped them in their tracks. Toby's eyes snapped to the source of the noise, his heart sinking as he saw them, Croft and his right-hand man, Hex Gideon. The two men emerged from the mist, their dark figures cutting through the trees like ghosts. Croft's expression was calm, almost too calm for a man who had just lost everything. He didn't look surprised to find them here. No, this was all part of his plan. The man was a predator, and Toby was no longer just a target. He was part of the game. Hex stepped forward, his rifle slung casually across his back. His cold, calculating eyes never left Toby. "You've made a mess," Miller Hex said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Now we clean it up." Toby's jaw clenched, his hands instinctively resting on the grip of his gun. But it was Croft who spoke next. "This is no longer just about weapons." Toby Croft's voice echoed through the cave, his tone smooth but filled with a terrifying finality. "It's about control." He stepped forward, and Toby saw what he held. A small black device about the size of a smartphone, but with a series of electronic components and blinking lights that Toby recognized instantly. It was a neuro-control device, the same kind of tech Toby had once worked with in the Sentinel Project. The Sentinel Project, Toby. Do you remember it? Croft's lips curled into a smirk. "Your little dog here," he said, turning his gaze to Koda, who was standing guard at Toby's side. His body tense, eyes watching Croft like a hawk was never just a pet. "Koda here was part of the program. You were a part of it too. You and your team. You were the test subjects, trained to follow orders no matter how brutal." Toby felt his blood run cold as he absorbed Croft's words. Koda, his loyal German shepherd, the one constant in his life, had been programmed. Toby had always known that Koda was special. But this was something else entirely. The dog had been part of a program to control minds, to turn soldiers, and even animals, into weapons. He looked at Koda, the betrayal washing over him. The device in Croft's hand was more than just a tool for controlling behavior. It was a key, A switch that would turn Koda back into something else, something dangerous. "No," Toby whispered, his voice hoarse, his chest tightening with emotion. "You won't get him back. He's mine, not yours." Croft laughed, his tone amused. "Mine?" He paused, his expression darkening. "No, Toby. He was never yours. You were just a pawn in the game, just like Koda. And now, we finish the game." He raised the device, his fingers hovering over a button. The signal it sent out was nearly invisible, but it was powerful. Too powerful. Toby watched in horror as Koda's body stiffened. The dog's muscles locked, his eyes glazed, and for the first time there was no recognition in his gaze, only obedience. Toby's heart shattered. He had never seen Koda like this, controlled. The dog was no longer the strong, independent companion Toby had known. He was a tool, a weapon, and that weapon was aimed at him. "No." Toby whispered, his voice a mix of fear and anguish. He dropped to his knees, reaching out to Koda. "Fight it, boy. You're stronger than this." Koda's body trembled, his eyes flickering with a moment of recognition, but the control was too strong. The signal was too powerful. The room felt like it was closing in on Toby, the weight of the situation, nearly suffocating him. His best friend, his only friend, was being taken from him. But just as the device began to hum louder, Koda's body tensed violently, his muscles shaking as he tried to fight the control. He growled low in his throat, the sound like a warning. Toby saw the dog's eyes flicker, the connection to the device struggling. "Koda," Toby shouted, his voice desperate. "Fight it. You're not a weapon." For a moment it seemed like Koda was lost to them. But then something shifted. The dog's body relaxed, his eyes brightening with clarity. The neurocontrol signal was faltering. Koda's eyes locked with Toby's, and in that moment the connection between them became more than just human and animal. It was a bond, a force stronger than any technology. With a loud, furious growl, Koda lunged forward, his teeth sinking into the device that Croft held in his hand. The device shattered with a sharp crack, sparks flying into the air as Koda tore it apart. Croft staggered back, stunned. "No!" he roared, but it was too late. Koda stood tall, his fur bristling, his chest heaving with the power of freedom. Toby reached out his hand, shaking as he touched Koda's head. The dog's eyes were clear again, filled with loyalty, but the damage had been done. "I won't let you control him," Toby said, his voice trembling, but firm. For a split second, Toby felt like time had stopped. The battle for Koda's soul was taking place before his eyes. The neurocontrol device Croft had wielded was still in his hand, a tool of manipulation, a signal